Have you ever imagined what it would feel like to discover that everything you know about your city, about your own family, is a carefully constructed lie? They laughed when Thomas decided to stay in the cemetery during the storm. They called him crazy when he walked towards the old chapel, the one that had been sealed for 60 years. But when the doors opened and the light emerged from within, no one was laughing anymore. What Thomas found that night would change not only his life, but would reveal a secret that an entire city had tried to bury forever. This is the true story of the caretaker who defied fear and discovered something no one should find. A simple man, 67 years old, who looked after a cemetery while everyone fled after nightfall. Thomas Mitchell didn't know that his decision to stay that stormy night would transform him into the bearer of truths that could destroy reputations, reveal hidden crimes, and expose lies kept for generations. Have you ever wondered why some doors are never opened? Why certain stories are buried along with those who lived them? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover goes far beyond a simple abandoned chapel. We're talking about love letters never delivered, confessions of murder hidden for decades, and secrets so dark that the most powerful people in a small Oregon town preferred to seal the truth rather than let it come to light. But before revealing what was inside that chapel, before you learn the word silence by fear and the ghosts that haunt not just a cemetery but entire consciences, you need to understand why it was sealed in the first place. What you are about to discover may surprise you, may make you question how many secrets exist in cities that seem so tranquil and perfect. How many truths have been buried so that superficial peace could continue? Thomas was no hero. He was just a cemetery caretaker who did his job diligently, who talked to tombstones as if they were old. Friends who never imagined that his curiosity about that forbidden building would lead him to become the guardian of something much greater, the memory of those who never had the courage to speak in life. Have you ever imagined what it would feel like to discover that everything you know about your city, about your own family, is a carefully constructed lie? They laughed when Thomas decided to stay in the cemetery during the storm. They called him crazy when he walked towards the old chapel, the one that had been sealed for 60 years. But when the doors opened and the light emerged from within, no one was laughing anymore. What Thomas found that night would change not only his life, but would reveal a secret that an entire city had tried to bury forever. This is the true story of the caretaker who defied fear and discovered something no one should find. A simple man, 67 years old, who looked after a cemetery while everyone fled after nightfall. Thomas Mitchell didn't know that his decision to stay that stormy night would transform him into the bearer of truth that could destroy reputations, reveal hidden crimes, and expose lies kept for generations. Have you ever wondered why some doors are never opened? Why certain stories are buried along with those who lived them? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover goes far beyond a simple abandoned chapel. We're talking about love letters never delivered, confessions of murder hidden for decades, and secrets so dark that the most powerful people in a small Oregon town preferred to seal the truth rather than let it come to light. But before revealing what was inside that chapel, before you learn the words silenced by fear and the ghosts that haunt not just a cemetery, but entire consciences, you need to understand why it was sealed in the first place. What you are about to discover may surprise you, may make you question how many secrets exist in cities that seem so tranquil and perfect. How many truths have been buried so that superficial peace could continue? Thomas was no hero. He was just a cemetery caretaker who did his job diligently, who talked to tombstones as if they were old friends, who never imagined that his curiosity about that forbidden building would lead him to become the guardian of something much greater, the memory of those who never had the courage to speak in life. And look, before we continue this journey together, I need to tell you something. I know that stories like this deeply affect us, making us reflect on our own unspoken truths, on those words we keep in our hearts for fear of releasing them. If this story is already touching your heart in some way, leave a comment below about what has impacted you the most so far. Is there a truth you wish you had told someone? A letter you never had the courage to write? Share it with me. Because this exchange is what transforms this channel into a true community of people seeking real and inspiring stories. And if you haven't liked this video yet, click that button now, because it's through your like that the algorithm understands that this type of content deserves to reach more people. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and brings these messages to those who really need to hear them. And if you're not yet subscribed, subscribe now and activate the bell, because every week I bring real stories that make us reflect on courage, truth, and what really matters in life. You won't want to miss what's coming. Now let's go back to that fateful night in Whispering Pines, when Thomas Mitchell was about to discover that some truths cannot be buried forever, no matter how many chains are placed on the doors that guard them. Thomas Mitchell was 67 years old when his journey of transformation truly began. He was the caretaker of the Whispering Pines Cemetery, a small town in Oregon where everyone knew each other, where secrets were whispered behind closed doors, and where the appearance of normalcy was more important than the truth. Thomas was a simple man, widowed for almost a decade, who found purpose precisely where most people fled, among tombstones, withered flowers, and the silence of those who had already departed. While others avoided that place after nightfall, he remained watering flowers with the same dedication as someone tending a living garden, cleaning tombstones as if preserving sacred memories, conversing with the graves as if they were old friends who still had stories to tell. The town saw him as eccentric, the kind of person small communities tolerate but never truly understand. There was something about him that bothered the residents of Whispering Pines, perhaps because Thomas represented what they feared most, someone who wasn't afraid to face death, to live with it daily, to accept that everyone eventually ends up on the same side of the tombstones he cleaned so carefully. But what no one knew was that this different mindset, this ability to see beyond the fear that paralyzes most, would prepare Thomas for what was to come. His daily decisions to stay when others fled, to care when others abandoned, were shaping a man capable of facing truths that destroy ordinary people. But there was one place that not even Thomas dared to touch, a blind spot in his seemingly unwavering courage. The Chapel of St. Mary, built in 1889, stood in the oldest corner of the cemetery like a silent sentinel of forbidden secrets. Its doors were sealed with chains and padlocks in 1963, and since then no one spoke of the reason. It was as if the entire town had made a pact of silence, a collective conspiracy to erase from memory what was hidden behind those locked doors. Whenever Thomas asked the elders about the chapel, he received evasive glances, vague answers, or simply a heavy silence that spoke louder than any words could express. The visual impact of that building was disturbing. The windows were covered with boards of wood rotted by time, as if someone wanted to ensure that nothing inside would ever see the light of day again, and that nothing outside could witness the inner workings of that sealed mystery. The entrance was blocked not just by a chain, but by several layers of them, intertwined with padlocks from different eras, as if successive generations had added their own guarantees that the door would remain closed. And that faded sign, with letters that time had almost completely erased, was still legible enough to convey its grim message: no entry, municipal order. There was no explanation, no context, just an order that was expected to be obeyed without question. For years, Thomas respected that invisible boundary. He cleaned around the chapel, cut the grass that grew wild in its foundations, but never got too close to the doors. It was as if an invisible force kept him at a distance, an instinctive respect for what the community had decided to bury. But human curiosity is a persistent seed, and the more time passed, the more Thomas wondered what revelations were imprisoned there, what truths the entire town conspired to keep hidden. He didn't know it yet, but this curiosity, this growing restlessness, was about to lead him down a path that would change not only his understanding of Whispering Pines, but of his own history. Thomas's curiosity about that chapel wasn't merely casual. It was visceral almost, obsessive. He passed through the rusty gates every day and felt that growing unease, that sensation that something was begging to be discovered, to be freed from chains that were not only physical, but also emotional and historical. The windows, covered with rotten wooden planks, seemed like blindfolds to a truth that couldn't see the light of day, and the entrance, blocked by rusty chains, represented much more than a simple physical barrier. It was the symbol of a collective decision to keep the past locked away, to prevent certain revelations from coming to light, and disturbing the superficial peace that Whispering Pines had built upon foundations of silence. The townspeople had a curious reaction whenever someone mentioned the chapel. They would instantly look away, as if merely speaking of it could summon something dangerous, as if words had the power to break a spell of forgetfulness that the community had cast upon itself. Mrs. Pearson, an 89-year-old woman with eyes that had seen entire generations born and die in Whispering Pines, once grabbed Thomas's arm with surprising force for someone her age and whispered with an urgency that made him stop completely. "Let the dead rest, son. Some doors have been closed for a good reason." The intensity in her voice wasn't just advice, it was almost a plea, a warning laden with decades of weight that Thomas couldn't fully comprehend at that moment. But there was something that neither Mrs. Pearson nor anyone else in town knew. Thomas noticed things that others preferred to ignore. On full moon nights, when the cemetery was bathed in that silvery, ghostly light, he perceived a faint light pulsing through the cracks in the boards covering the chapel windows. It wasn't moonlight reflecting. It was something different, something from within, a pale, trembling luminosity that seemed to have a life of its own. And even more disturbing, he swore he heard music emanating from those walls that should have been completely empty. A distant, almost angelic choir, voices harmonizing in melodies that didn't belong to any specific era, sounds that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end and his heart race with a mixture of fear and fascination. At first, Thomas questioned his own sanity. Perhaps it was just the wind passing through the cracks. Perhaps his imagination was playing tricks on him from spending so much time alone among the dead. But the consistency of the phenomena was undeniable. Always on. Full moon nights. Always the same pulsating light. Always that ethereal chorus that seemed to carry emotions he couldn't name. Sadness mixed with hope. Despair intertwined with peace. As if imprisoned souls were singing their untold stories across the barriers of time and oblivion. The entire town pretended the chapel didn't exist, and that was perhaps the most disturbing revelation for Thomas. It was a passive conspiracy, a tacit agreement that if everyone simply ignored the building, if no one spoke about it, if new generations never asked questions, then perhaps whatever was hidden there would simply disappear. But the truth doesn't work that way. Hidden truths don't evaporate simply because we decide not to look at them. They accumulate, gain weight, become ever more powerful precisely because of the silence that surrounds them. And Thomas, with his unique mindset shaped by years of conversing with tombstones and finding meaning where others saw only death, was beginning to understand that the chapel wasn't just an abandoned building, it was a living repository of something the town desperately wanted to forget. Thomas's transformation was gradual but inevitable. Every night he heard that music, every time he saw that mysterious light, every evasive glance from the villagers when he mentioned the chapel, all of it was reshaping his understanding of Whispering Pines and the impact buried secrets have on entire communities. The chapel existed. That was undeniable. And, in some inexplicable way, it was calling to Thomas specifically, as if he had been chosen for a journey he didn't yet fully comprehend. If you're feeling that growing tension, that need to find out what comes next, then subscribe to the channel now, because you're exactly the kind of person who values stories that go beyond the superficial, who isn't afraid to delve into the inner workings of human nature and uncover the truths that everyone prefers to keep hidden. It was on an October night that everything changed, that Thomas's journey took a turn that no one, not even he, could have foreseen. A violent storm struck Whispering Pines with a fury that seemed almost supernatural, as if nature itself were tired of keeping secrets and had decided it was time to force revelations that had been overdue for decades. Winds of over 100 kilometers per hour toppled centuries-old trees as if they were matchsticks, tearing branches that flew through the air, transformed into dangerous projectiles, and the rain fell with such intensity that it seemed like blades cutting through the air, each drop hitting the ground with enough force to create small craters in the soaked earth of the cemetery. The mayor ordered an immediate evacuation of the cemetery, his voice crackling through the old radio Thomas kept in his small guardhouse cabin. "Thomas, you need to get out now. This storm is too dangerous. The trees are falling. You're not safe out there." The urgency in the mayor's voice was real, grounded in decades of experience with Oregon's unpredictable weather, but something inside Thomas told him to stay. It wasn't stubbornness, it wasn't irresponsibility. It was an inexplicable force that kept him rooted to that place, a deep, visceral feeling that this was the moment his whole life had been building towards, as if decades of silence were about to end and he needed to be there to witness it. The transformation of the night happened in an instant. Thomas was looking out the fogged window of his guard post when he heard the sound that would change everything. Crack! A bang so powerful it made the ground tremble beneath his feet, a sound impossible to ignore or confuse with anything else. A lightning bolt, brighter than any light he had ever seen, descended from the heavy heavens and struck the chapel squarely, as if the universe had specifically aimed at that target, as if forces beyond human comprehension had decided that 60 years of sealed doors were enough. The impact was devastating and liberating at the same time. The wooden planks covering the windows exploded in instant flames, the wood, rotten with age, burning with an orange intensity that illuminated the entire cemetery as if it were daytime. The chains that had kept those doors closed for 6 decades melted under the unbearable heat of the lightning, the metal transforming into incandescent liquid before crashing to the ground with a metallic bang that echoed throughout the cemetery, a definitive final sound, as if a chapter of history was being forcibly closed. The torrential rain quickly extinguished the flames, leaving only smoke rising from the smoldering ruins of the planks that had for so long blocked any view of the interior. The doors were open for the first time in 60 years, wide open, gaping like a mouth ready to reveal long-swallowed secrets, inviting or daring anyone brave enough to enter. Thomas stood paralyzed in the torrential rain that soaked his clothes and streamed down his face like icy tears, his eyes fixed on that dark entrance that now beckoned him, that seemed to pulse with an energy he could feel even from a distance. It was fear mixed with purpose, terror intertwined with destiny, a completely new mindset forming within him at that very moment. His colleagues shouted into the radio with growing desperation, their voices distorted by static but still understandable. "Have you gone mad? Get out of there. Thomas, this storm is getting worse. You need to get to a shelter now." They were voices of genuine concern, from people who didn't want him to get hurt, but who couldn't understand what he was feeling. The inexplicable certainty that this was his most important decision, the moment that would define not only the rest of his life, but possibly the future of all of Whispering Pines. Thomas looked at the radio, then at the chapel with its open doors revealing only impenetrable darkness inside, and made the decision. That would change everything. He picked up his flashlight, quickly tested if it still worked despite the dampness, felt the familiar weight of the metal in his trembling hand, and began to walk towards the impossible, each step an act of courage or madness, depending on who was judging. The first step inside the chapel was like stepping through a portal to another time, and the smell hit him first, even before his eyes could adjust to the darkness. It was a peculiar combination of old wood, impregnated by decades of dampness and isolation, candles extinguished so long ago that only the ghost of their waxy scent remained, and something surprisingly sweet, almost cloying, like flowers that never withered, as if time had stopped inside that sealed space, and the natural decay of things had been suspended for some inexplicable reason. Thomas took a deep breath, feeling that heavy air fill his lungs, laden with history and secrets that were about to be revealed. Thomas's flashlight cut through the thick darkness with a beam of yellowish light that trembled in his hand, revealing layer by layer the transformation that sacred space had undergone over 6 decades of isolation. Church pews covered in such a thick layer of dust that it resembled grey snow, broken stained glass windows that must once have been magnificent but were now just colourful fragments hanging in rotting frames, and in the background, an altar that should have been empty but wasn't. Thomas advanced slowly, each step raising clouds of dust that danced in the beam of light like small disturbed spirits, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it echoing in his ears. The altar wasn't covered with the typical religious objects one would expect to find. It was covered with hundreds, perhaps thousands, of envelopes yellowed with age, stacked with an almost reverent care, arranged in a way that suggested purpose and intention, not abandonment. It was as if someone had transformed that sacred space into a repository of something even more sacred than prayers, an archive of souls expressed through handwritten words on paper that was now as fragile as onion skin. Thomas's hands trembled uncontrollably as he picked up the first envelope from the top of the nearest pile, his fingers leaving marks in the dust covering the paper. He carefully turned the envelope over and read the words written in an elegant handwriting that belonged to another era. Margaret Holloway, never delivered. Those last 2 words hit Thomas like a punch to the gut, carrying a weight of sadness and missed opportunities that was almost physical. He picked up another envelope, then another, each revealing an untold story, an unrealized impact, a connection that never happened. To Jonathan Reed, awaiting your return, read one, the ink faded but still legible, carrying decades of hope that was probably never reciprocated. My dearest Elizabeth, if you still remember me, was written on another, the words carrying a vulnerability so raw that Thomas felt as if he were invading something deeply intimate. There were hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, scattered all over the altar and even the nearby pews, each envelope a universe of unexpressed emotions, each letter a window into a heart that had been afraid to fully reveal itself. Love letters that never reached their recipient, farewell letters that never brought closure, letters of forgiveness that left wounds forever open, all dated between 1940 and 1963, a period of 23 years during which this place apparently served as a confessional of hidden truths, as a sanctuary of words that people could not speak aloud. The mentality behind this place began to become clear to Thomas, the revelation gradually building in his mind as he held those fragile envelopes. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine as the full realization hit him like a lightning bolt. These were letters from dead people, written to other dead people. He knew many of the names on the tombstones outside the cemetery, had cleaned those stones hundreds of times, and now he was holding the unspoken words of those same people. But why were they there, preserved with such care instead of destroyed or given away? Who brought them to this place and decided they deserved to be kept in a sacred space? And more importantly, why had the entire city conspired to seal these truths away instead of letting them see the light of day? Thomas's journey was only beginning, but he already felt he had crossed a threshold of no return, that the decisions he would make from this moment on would have consequences that would extend far beyond his own life. If you're as impacted as Thomas was at that moment, if you need to discover what these letters reveal and why they were hidden, then subscribe to the channel now, because you're the kind of person who understands that some stories need to be told, no matter how long they've been buried. It was then that he saw, almost, hidden behind a pile of envelopes on the elevated pulpit, a black leather-bound diary that seemed to pulse with importance, even covered by that thick layer of dust. It was preserved in an almost supernatural way, as if time had stopped specifically to protect that object, as if the decades of dampness and decay that affected everything else in that chapel had deliberately spared that particular book. Thomas walked toward the pulpit with slow, almost reverent steps, feeling that he was about to discover the central piece of the puzzle, the revelation that would explain everything he was seeing. His hands still trembled as he brushed the dust off the leather cover, revealing words engraved in gold that time had faded but not completely erased. Diary of Father Michael Sullivan, 1960-1963. Thomas knew this name from the stories the elders told, a priest who had mysteriously disappeared in 1963, whose sudden departure was never properly explained, and whom the town preferred to simply forget, yet another inconvenient chapter that Whispering Pines decided to erase from its collective memory. Thomas opened the diary with trembling hands, the leather creaking softly as if it were breathing for the first time in decades. The first pages described completely normal chapel routines, Sunday services attended by respectable families, baptisms of children whose names Thomas recognized from the newest tombstones in the cemetery, weddings celebrated with hope and joy. It was the ordinary life of a small church in a small town, nothing that justified the mystery or fear that surrounded the place. But as Thomas turned the yellowed pages, the tone began to change, subtly but unmistakably, the entries becoming progressively more troubled, heavier with the weight of secrets being entrusted to the priest. An entry from March 15, 1962, made Thomas stop completely, his breath catching in his throat as he read, "They keep coming at night. People from the city I've known for years, respectable faces I see on the benches every Sunday, now appear after the sun sets carrying letters they never dared to send, secrets they could never confess aloud, loves they never declared for fear of rejection or judgment. They ask me to keep their words here in this sacred space, hoping that somehow on the other side their loved ones might receive them, might finally know the truth that remained trapped in closed hearts." The transformation of Father Sullivan from a simple spiritual guardian to a protector of hidden truths was documented page by page, and Thomas turned more pages with increasingly rapid breathing, feeling the growing urgency in the words written decades ago. The entry from August 2, 1963, hit him like a punch. "I discovered something terrible. Among the letters of genuine love and sincere pleas for forgiveness, I found confessions of real crimes, murders that the city believes to be accidents, betrayals that destroyed entire families but remain secret, revelations that could completely ruin the most powerful people in this city, those whose reputations are built on carefully maintained lies. I don't know what to do with this knowledge. I can't break the secrecy of these confessions, but I also can't simply ignore the magnitude of what is being hidden." The impact of those words on Thomas was profound, making him realize that this chapel was not merely a repository of romantic regrets or unspoken words of familial love. It was a complete archive of Whispering Pines' hypocrisy, of the dark underbelly of a community that presented itself as exemplary but harbored rot beneath its polished surface. And then he reached the last entry, the handwriting visibly different from the previous ones, written in a trembling script that suggested fear or extreme urgency. The date was August 20th, 1963, just 18 days after the previous entry, and the words carried a weight of finality that made Thomas's heart race. "They know that I know they came tonight, not as parishioners seeking spiritual comfort, but as conspirators protecting their secrets. They demanded that I burn everything, that I destroy every letter, every confession, every fragment of truth that could expose them. But these letters are naked souls. They are the only real honesty these people have ever expressed in their lives. I cannot destroy them. I will seal the chapel. I will protect these truths, even if it means my own disappearance. If you are reading this, whoever you are, tell the truth they tried to bury. Don't let fear and power continue to stifle honesty." Thomas slowly closed the diary, his hands no longer trembling with nervousness, but with growing determination. He finally understood the full magnitude of what lay before him, the responsibility that Father Sullivan had left to whoever had the courage to open those doors. With his heart racing and Father Sullivan's words echoing in his mind like a call that spanned decades, Thomas began methodically searching through the piles of letters, looking for those the priest had mentioned in his diary, confessions that had enough power to destroy the most influential people in Whispering Pines. His hands moved purposefully now, no longer trembling with fear but vibrating with the adrenaline of discovery. Each envelope he opened, revealing layers of hypocrisy that completely transformed his understanding of the town he called home. The first letter he found literally made him stumble backward, bracing himself on one of the dusty benches to avoid falling. It was a detailed confession of the arson that killed 5 people in 1959, an event Thomas vaguely remembered from stories he heard as a child, always described as an accidental tragedy caused by faulty wiring. But there, in words written in firm, determined handwriting, lay the hidden truth. The fire was intentional, planned to destroy evidence of corruption that could have ruined political careers. And it was signed by then City Councilman Harold Pembroke, a man whose statue still stood in the town's main square, honored as a civic hero and benefactor of the community. The impact of that revelation was still reverberating in Thomas when he opened another letter, and this one was even more devastating. It revealed that the accidental death of young Sarah Morrison, a 19-year-old girl who supposedly fell from the cliffs near the river in 1961, was no accident at all. The letter was written by Dr. James Morrison, her own father, one of the most respected doctors Whispering Pines had ever had, confessing in painful detail how he couldn't bear the shame of having a pregnant, unmarried daughter at a time when it would ruin the reputation of the entire family. The words were cold, almost clinical, describing how he convinced Sarah to walk with him to the cliffs, how he pushed her, how he then orchestrated the investigation to ensure it was declared an accident. Letter after letter exposed the moral decay hidden beneath Whispering Pines' respectable facade, each revelation more shocking than the last. There were confessions of embezzlement of public funds, of systemic abuses of power, of lies that destroyed innocent lives while protecting the guilty. Thomas realized he was holding not just paper and ink, but evidence of decades of crimes that remained not only unpunished, but actively hidden by the very community that prided itself on its values and morality. The transformation in his mindset was now complete. Thomas understood everything with crystal clarity. These powerful people had discovered that Father Sullivan was keeping his confessions instead of destroying them, and they realized that as long as those letters existed, their carefully constructed reputations were in constant danger. So they made the decision to seal the truth within that chapel, literally imprisoning honesty behind chains and padlocks, preferring to live with the lie rather than face the consequences of their actions. And the priest, Thomas now understood, had probably paid with his own freedom or life for refusing to be complicit in this conspiracy of silence. But it was just as Thomas was about to put the letters back that something made him stop completely, his blood freezing in his veins. There was an envelope there, separate from the others, that seemed to be waiting specifically for him. The handwriting on the front was too familiar, so familiar that for a moment he couldn't process what he was seeing. He knew that handwriting. He'd seen it on hundreds of birthday cards, on shopping lists left on the refrigerator, on love notes his parents exchanged when they thought he wasn't looking. With hands that now trembled for entirely different reasons, Thomas opened the envelope and began to read, each word like a blade cutting through everything he thought he knew about his own life. My dearest Thomas, forgive me for never having had the courage to tell you about your true origins. Forgive me for the secrets I carried alone, and that I now take to the grave without ever having released this weight from my heart. Your father was not who you always thought he was. The man who raised you, who loved you as a son, did so out of love for me, not out of blood. Your true origins are a secret I protected to spare you the pain that the truth would bring. With eternal love and deep regret, Mother. Thomas fell to his knees right there on the dusty chapel floor, the letter still clutched in his trembling hands. The journey he thought he was undertaking to uncover the secrets of Whispering Pines had just become intensely personal, and he realized that his own life was part of the tapestry of lies that town had woven. If you're feeling the weight of this revelation, if you understand what it means to discover that your own story is part of something much bigger, then subscribe to the channel now, because you value narratives that aren't afraid to explore the hardest truths, even when they strike at the heart. Thomas remained kneeling on the cold, dusty floor of the chapel for an indefinite amount of time, the concept of minutes and hours completely losing its meaning as he held that letter as if it were the most fragile and precious thing in the world. His mother had left that confession there decades before she died, probably in the late 60s, when the chapel was already sealed, but Father Sullivan was still alive to receive its hidden truth somehow. A confession she never had the courage to make in life, neither to the son she loved, nor to the husband who accepted her with all her secrets. He read each word again, then once more, hot tears streaming down his face and creating clean trails through the dust that had accumulated on his skin, discovering that his entire life had been built on a loving lie, a truth hidden not out of malice, but out of protection. The man he had called father for 67 years, who had taught him to ride a bicycle, who had comforted him when his first girlfriend broke up with him, who had worked 2 jobs to pay for his college education. This man had raised him out of pure, unconditional love, even knowing they didn't share true blood. The revelation didn't diminish the love Thomas felt, but it added layers of complexity and sacrifice he had never imagined existed. In that profoundly transformative moment, kneeling in the sanctuary of secrets that Whispering Pines had tried to bury, Thomas understood the true weight of that chapel in a way that went far beyond the revelations of crime and corruption he had uncovered. It wasn't just a repository of dark secrets guarded by people who wanted to protect tarnished reputations. It was something far more complex and humanly imperfect, a sanctuary of souls imprisoned by the fear of rejection, by the shame imposed by rigid social norms, by unrequited love, or love never declared because the right moment never came. Each letter represented a life not fully lived, an existence where part of someone's essential truth was suppressed because the cost of revealing it seemed too high, and forgiveness that was never asked for because pride or fear were insurmountable barriers, leaving relationships broken forever when simple words could have healed deep wounds. An unspoken truth that remained stuck in someone's throat until death made it impossible to express, leaving only regret and speculation for those who remained. Thomas looked around the chapel with completely new eyes, seeing not just piles of yellowed paper, but a collection of naked human hearts in their most vulnerable form. And Father Sullivan, the man the town preferred to forget, had given these fragmented souls a sacred place to exist, to be honest, at least on paper, to deposit their burdens even if only in sealed envelopes that might never be read. He had created an unconventional confessional where people could be completely truthful without fear of immediate judgment, where they could express what the Society of Whispering Pines made impossible to say aloud. But when the city discovered the magnitude of what was being kept there, when it realized that its carefully guarded lies were documented and preserved, it preferred to seal off the truth rather than confront it. They chose chains and padlocks instead of honesty and reconciliation. They decided it was better to imprison authenticity than risk the disintegration of the respectable facade they had built. And in that decision, the mentality of an entire community was revealed. Appearance mattered more than substance, reputation was more valuable than integrity, and the comfort of lies was preferable to the temporary discomfort of truth. Thomas wiped away his tears with the back of his dusty hand, dark blotches forming on his face, and looked at his mother's letter once more. He had a monumental decision to make, a choice that would define not only the rest of his own life, but potentially the future of all of Whispering Pines. He could follow the town's example and seal everything off again, pretend he never saw anything, let the dead rest as Mrs. Pearson had suggested. Or he could honor Father Sullivan's last request and tell the truth they had tried to bury, knowing it would cause pain, destroy reputations, and force the town to confront the dark undercurrents of its history. Thomas's journey had begun with simple curiosity about a mysterious chapel, but now it had transformed into something much bigger. He was the guardian not only of a cemetery, but of truths that had the power to liberate or devastate, depending on how he chose to use them. Thomas left the chapel as the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, carrying an old cardboard box he had found in one of the corners of the sacristy, now filled with the most important letters, those containing not only personal confessions, but evidence of real crimes and truths that entire families deserved to know. The storm had completely passed, leaving Whispering Pines washed and silent, only the comforting sound of water dripping from the trees and the morning bird song breaking the stillness. But Thomas knew that this peace was temporary, that the storm he was about to unleash would be far more devastating and lasting than any meteorological phenomenon. His first stop was straight to the local newspaper, where editor Margaret Chen was arriving to open the small office that had published the Whispering Pines Gazette for 3 generations. The expression on Thomas's face, combined with the box he carried with almost religious reverence, was enough for her to know that something extraordinary was about to happen. He spent hours showing her letter after letter, documenting decades of secrets, and Margaret, being a journalist to the core, immediately understood the monumental impact of what she was seeing. Then he went to the sheriff's office, where Sheriff Anderson initially resisted, arguing that crimes so old couldn't be prosecuted. But Thomas insisted that the truth mattered regardless of statutes of limitations. And finally, he went to the town's main church, where he confronted the parish council with evidence that their own institution had been complicit in covering up truths that the faith community should have upheld. The truth erupted like a volcano dormant for 60 years, the accumulated pressure of decades of enforced silence, finally finding release. The newspaper published a special series of reports that spanned weeks, each edition revealing new layers of what had been hidden in that sealed chapel. The transformation of Whispering Pines was immediate and profound, the town literally splitting in two as it processed revelations that shattered its carefully cultivated self-image. Some families found answers to mysteries that had tormented them for decades, finally understanding inexplicable behaviors or traumatic events that never made complete sense. Children, now adults, discovered through these letters that emotionally distant parents loved them deeply and unconditionally, but simply didn't know how to express affection in a way a child could understand, trapped in patterns of toxic masculinity or unresolved traumas of their own. Elderly widows read with tears of joy and sadness mixed together the love letters their husbands wrote decades ago but never had the courage to deliver. Romantic and vulnerable words that would have transformed entire marriages if they had been shared in life. But other truths were absolutely devastating, destroying not only reputations, but also the sense of security and trust that small communities depend on to function. Scandals came to light involving figures who were considered pillars of society, revealing that respected doctors, honored civic leaders, and admired businessmen had committed acts that completely contradicted their public personas. Reputations, meticulously built on lies and appearances, crumbled in a matter of days. Statues were removed from the main square, street names were changed, and entire families had to confront the fact that their surnames carried the weight of unpaid crimes. The town was viscerally divided between those who embraced the truth as a necessary liberation, arguing that Whispering Pines could never be truly healthy while built on foundations of lies, and those who desperately preferred the comfort of ignorance, arguing that stirring up the past only caused unnecessary pain, and that some things should remain buried for the good of all. Town council meetings turned into heated debates, decades-long friendships ended in bitter arguments, and the collective mindset of the community underwent a painful but perhaps necessary transformation. Thomas was called a hero by some who saw him as a courageous man, willing to do what was right, regardless of the personal cost, someone who honored the memory of Father Sullivan and gave voice to those who died with truths trapped in their hearts. But he was also called a traitor by others, who accused him of destroying the peace of the city for ego or attention, of causing unnecessary pain to families who had already suffered enough, of not respecting the dead enough to let their secrets rest. But Thomas knew with an unwavering certainty, stemming from reading that last entry in the priest's diary, that Father Sullivan had entrusted those vulnerable souls specifically to someone with enough courage to free them from the prison of silence, and he was at peace with his decision, even as he faced the consequences. If you're sensing the complexity of this situation, if you understand that doing the right thing often means facing opposition and criticism, then subscribe to the channel now, because you value stories about people who make tough decisions guided by principles rather than popularity. Today, 3 years after that stormy night that changed everything, St. Mary's Chapel has been fully restored, but not as an active church where sermons are preached and sacraments are administered. It has been transformed into a living memorial, a space dedicated to the memory of unspoken words and the devastating impact that enforced silence can have on human lives. The restoration was funded by donations from families who found closure through the letters, people who were finally able to understand confusing chapters of their family histories, and who wanted to honor Father Sullivan's courage in preserving those truths when it would have been much easier to destroy them. Letters that did not contain confessions of crimes or genuinely destructive secrets were meticulously catalogued by a team of volunteers led by Margaret Chen herself, and made available to the families descended from those who wrote them or to whom they were addressed. It was a long and emotionally exhausting process, involving amateur and professional genealogists working together to trace family lineages across decades. Many of these letters were finally delivered to their recipients in a profoundly moving way, being read aloud at graves by children who never fully knew their parents, by grandchildren who discovered grandparents far more complex and human than family histories suggested, and by great-grandchildren who learned that vulnerability and unspoken love are legacies that transcend generations. A polished bronze plaque was installed at the restored entrance to the chapel, its words carefully chosen by a committee that included Thomas, survivors of events mentioned in the letters, and community leaders who had embraced the difficult but necessary transformation of Whispering Pines. The plaque simply reads, "Here rest the words that fear silenced. May we never again have to seal away our truths." It is a statement of both lament for the past and commitment to a different future, an acknowledgement that healthy communities are built on honesty, not on carefully maintained appearances. Thomas remains the cemetery caretaker, his daily routine of watering flowers and cleaning tombstones remaining essentially the same. But now, at 70 years old, he has a completely new mission that gives even more purpose to his daily tasks. He helps living people write letters that will be delivered while they are still alive, not after death. Every Saturday morning, the restored chapel opens its doors for sessions that Thomas affectionately calls truth workshops, where people of all ages come to write letters of forgiveness that liberate both the forgiver and the forgiven, love letters that express feelings that have been kept hidden for fear of vulnerability, letters of gratitude that acknowledge positive impacts that often go unnoticed in the busy daily life of modern times. The mindset behind this work is revolutionary in its simplicity. If people had the courage to express their truths while there is still time, perhaps they wouldn't need to leave undelivered letters in sealed chapels. Thomas learned something profound that stormy night, which he now shares with everyone who participates in his workshops. While watering the carefully planted flowers at the chapel entrance, he often tells visitors, "Unspoken words are the most haunting ghosts that exist, more terrifying than any horror story because they haunt not cemeteries but living hearts. Don't wait until it's too late, until death or distance or simply the passage of time makes it impossible to say what needs to be said. Don't let your most important truths be sealed behind chains of fear or shame or simply procrastination." He often pauses in his work, gazing at the restored chapel that now gleams in the sunlight instead of hiding in the darkness of buried secrets, and smiles with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has found his true purpose through an unexpected journey. Father Sullivan was absolutely right about something fundamental to human nature and truth, Thomas reflects aloud to anyone nearby. Truth always finds a way to the surface, no matter how many layers of lies are piled upon it, no matter how many chains are used to bind it. Sometimes it just needs to wait for the right moment and the right person, someone brave enough to open the door that everyone else prefers to keep closed. The transformation of Whispering Pines remains a gradual and sometimes painful process, but the town is slowly learning that authenticity, even when uncomfortable, creates far more solid foundations than perfect facades built on flimsy lies. Look, if you've made it this far with me, to the end of this journey with Thomas and all these truths that have come to light after 60 years of being buried, I'm sure you're someone who values stories that go deep, that touch real places in the human heart. And that means a lot, seriously. In a world where everyone jumps from video to video without really absorbing anything, you chose to stay and listen to this whole story. That says a lot about who you are. If this video resonated with you in any way, if it made you think about those words you haven't yet said, about those truths you've been keeping to yourself, leave a like below. It's not just for the algorithm, it's because when you like it, you're telling me that stories like this resonate with you, that it's worthwhile for me to continue bringing you this kind of content that isn't superficial. that goes beyond empty entertainment. And leave a comment here saying, "This message was for me," that's all. Because I want to know that you're here, that you're part of this community of people who aren't afraid to look inward and reflect on their own decisions and unspoken truths. Each comment shows me that there are real people on the other side, and that inspires me to continue researching and bringing stories like this. If you're not already subscribed, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because every week I bring you real stories that make us question, reflect, and grow. It's not just entertainment. It's content that stays with you, that changes the way you see the world and your own choices. And look, there's a video right here that perfectly complements this topic, about people who had the courage to say what needed to be said before it was too late. Click and continue with me there, because the conversation doesn't have to end here. Thank you for staying until the end. See you in the next video.